Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'll tell you about a homeowners association that thinks it owns the river. 3 weeks after I slid my old trawler, thick-beamed, diesel calm, the kind of boat that makes you slow your speech, into the little slip behind my house, I woke up to a bright orange sign bobbing in the river like a traffic cone on vacation. It was tethered to a steel cable stretched across the water from my neighbor's lot to a rotting stump on the opposite bank. The sign read, "Private water, members only. Swim hours 10-4. Beneath it, a smaller placard added, "All vessels require HOA-issued river transit sticker. Non-compliance subject to fines." I stood on my dock in bare feet with a coffee that had suddenly turned sour. The current nudged my hull as if to ask, "You seeing this?" My dog, Harbor, sat beside me, head tilted, equal parts baffled and insulted. The association president, a tall man with a permanent tan and a posture like a golf tee, I'll call him Gunner, waved from the common area above. "Morning," he shouted, cheerful the way a ticket writer is cheerful. "We had to formalize some rules, safety and liability, you get it." "Safety?" I called back. "What part of dragging a steel cable across a navigable river is safety?" He smiled larger and cupped his hand to his ear. "Can't hear you over the water." That was my first clue that this had nothing to do with hearing and everything to do with power. I'd moved to this river stretch after a decade of living out of a duffel on work trips. I wanted slow mornings, gulls that sounded like comedians doing impressions, and the right to untie and go whenever the sky looked like a postcard. The property came with a narrow lot and a short dock, and, crucially, riparian rights stated in boring legal text in my deed. Access to and use of the river adjacent to my property, subject to public navigational servitude. Non-exclusive, sure, shared of course, but real. There was an HOA here, but the covenant I read before buying said nothing about controlling the river. It covered fence heights, mailbox shapes, and whether we were allowed patio umbrellas with stripes. We were not. It referenced the common area boat ramp but stopped at the waterline like a kid dipping a toe. The trouble started when I put the boat in. The trawler isn't flashy, but she's honest. The previous owner customized her for long river runs and weekend anchor outs. I replaced some soft lines, updated the navigation lights, and named her with vinyl letters that made me smile. That was enough to get me on Gunner's radar. He came by the day after the cable went up, strolling onto my dock with all the softness of a clipboard. "How are we settling in?" he asked, already out of breath like the question itself required effort. "Pretty well," I said. "Aside from the highway chain you installed in front of my bow." He looked sympathetic in a way that felt rehearsed. "We've had incidents. Teenagers, strangers, folks swimming at odd hours. Liability. The board voted to enforce reasonable restrictions on our section of the river for safety. Just need to get your river transit sticker, sign the water rules, and we'll cut your line a gate." "A gate?" I repeated because maybe it would sound less absurd if I heard it again. "You know," he said, gesturing at the cable, "we'll clip you an opening, but only during swim hours or if someone's on duty." I glanced at the current, then at the blackbirds on the opposite bank, then back at this man with a friendly smile and a knuckle-whitening grip on his laminated folder. "You can't fence a river," I said. "That water is public. The state holds it in trust. The feds have authority over navigation. You can't block it." Gunner said the same line everyone says when they're about to ignore the Constitution with a piece of tape. "Well, actually," he flipped open his folder and pulled a page from a stack of what looked like printouts from a search engine. "Our attorney says we can regulate for safety inside the community limits. It's been done before. We're not restricting anyone from access. We're managing it. Reasonably." "Your attorney," I said, "should meet the river. Maybe they can shake hands." His smile thinned. "I'll be sending you an invoice for the transit sticker and your portion of the cable installation, plus a fine for launching without prior approval." I told him he could send whatever he wanted. I also told him I wouldn't be paying it. The river moved between us with no interest in our conversation. Harbor huffed and lay down with her chin over her paws. A perfect summary of my feelings. That afternoon, I read everything that mattered. If you've never fallen down a rabbit hole of water law, it's a lot like boating itself. It looks calm from the surface, but the current underneath is no joke. The phrase that kept showing up in treatises, state statutes, and cases with names like "people vs. someone who tried it" was navigable waters. If a river is navigable in fact, used or capable of being used as a highway for commerce, it falls under the public trust and the federal navigational servitude. Private property owners can have riparian rights, but they don't own the water. They can build docks with permits, they can enjoy access, but they can't exclude the public from the waterway or impede navigation. The state holds the bed and banks in trust for the public, and the feds care a lot about obstructions. I called a friend I'll call Vance, a land surveyor who can eyeball distance in inches across a football field. He checked my deed description against the plat. He confirmed what I'd believed. My lot extended to the waterline and then stopped. The river was not their toy. They string a cable there, he said, and they're going to learn words like injunction and civil penalty. Good, I said, because their sign says I can't swim after 4. My niece was supposed to come this weekend. She's 8. She just learned to jump in without plugging her nose, and she's going to see that sign and think she's doing something wrong for wanting to float in July. I'm not having that. The cable was a real one, not a streamer. Steel buoyed every 30 feet by bright drums, with a ratchet tensioner anchored to a bollard someone had sunk into the common grass. The opposite side was tied around an old stump that had probably outlived 3 floods and 2 generations of carp. The HOA had painted the bollard green, as if that made it scenery. I took photos. I took video. I recorded the sound it made when a skiff tried to nudge past and had to reverse with a face like someone who swallowed a lemon. The next day, I got 3 envelopes at once. The first was a newsletter-style announcement from the HOA with a list of water rule enhancements. No fishing from docks except during designated hours. No swimming except 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. No exceptions. No launching any vessel over 16 feet without prior board approval. All visitors must be wristbanded for the water. And this one, in bold, our portion of the river is private. For the enjoyment of dues-paying members, outsiders may be trespassed. The second envelope was an invoice for the transit sticker, the cable assessment, and a fine for unauthorized mooring. The third was a notice of a compliance hearing at next week's board meeting, where I could explain why penalties should not be increased. I sat at my table and flipped them like cards. Harbor watched with the patient look a dog gives when hoping the deck of cards produces bacon. I decided to be nice first. It's a habit I try to keep even when I'd rather skip it. I printed out portions of relevant law. I highlighted. I included a copy of my deed. I even summarized in plain English why a private group cannot block or control a public river. Because the law views water like a road with waves, and you don't get to put a gate across a road you don't own just because your house faces it. I walked my packet over to Gunner's mailbox and slid it inside. Then I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and lodged a report about an obstruction. They told me someone would check it out. I called the state environmental office and asked about permits for cables across rivers. Spoiler, not a thing. Then I called the regional office of the federal agency that cares when people pretend they own rivers. Those folks with the dredge and fill permits. I left a message and included the GPS coordinates because the world is easier when everyone talks coordinates. By evening, neighbors were buzzing. Not the whisper kind. The "what are we doing here" kind. My closest neighbor, a woman named Tilda who grows tomatoes like she's in a contest with the sun, came by with a basket and a serious face. "The board is out of control," she said. "They're bullying people. They chased a grandpa off last week who was teaching his grandson to cast into the current." "Because?" I asked. "He was from outside the neighborhood," she said. "He parks up by the bridge once a year to do it on the kid's birthday. He's been doing it for 7 years. They told him to leave or they'd call security." "There's no security," I said. "Exactly." The more stories I heard, the more I realized the cable was just the biggest, shiniest symptom. The new board, installed last winter in a blitz of proxy ballots and backyard promises of keeping things exclusive, had been churning out rules like a pea sheller. They restricted backyard lights. They outlawed kayaks stored on racks unless they were board-approved colors. They created a guest pass program for the boat ramp, complete with stickers that cost money to replace if they fell off in the rain. The president, Gunner, had been telling people the riverfront houses were Tier 1 members, as if river proximity granted a different class. He summoned a resident to a hearing for allowing his cousins to launch a canoe at dusk. I keep my cool better when I'm moving. So the following morning, I did what I always do when someone tells me I can't enjoy something they don't own. I went to enjoy it properly and within the law. I pre-flighted my boat like it was an airplane. Fuel shut-off valves checked, VHF radio tested, life jackets counted, whistles attached, fire extinguishers in date, documentation folder ready, lines coiled and easy. I texted my friend Vance to swing by. He showed up with a thermos and a grin. Today, he said, and I pointed at the cable. Today. We weren't reckless about it. We weren't trying to start a water park fight. I'd called the sheriff's office again and explained I intended to transit normally on a public waterway and encountered an obstruction. They said a deputy would be in the area. That was good enough for me. Before I untied, 2 board members appeared like mushrooms after rain. Gunnar and a woman I'd seen at the pool admonishing a kid for splashing. She introduced herself as Rita and handed me a paper to sign. Water rules acknowledgement, she said. I acknowledge the water exists, I said. We're good. She pursed her lips. You'll be fined for refusal to sign. Okay, I said. I laid the throttles forward to idle. The diesel hummed like a refrigerator. We eased out on lines and pointed the bow toward the cable. Neighbors gathered. Phones came out. Tilda stood with her hands on her hips. Someone wheeled up a cooler like there might be a tailgate. The cable sagged in the center. Gunnar stood by the ratchet tensioner with a determined look, ready to put his weight into it like a CrossFit move. I steered, slow and small, until my bow was a gentle handshake from the line. Then I shifted to neutral and held there, letting the current press the hull against the obvious stupidity. Vance called out, clear and polite, requesting passage on a public navigable waterway. Gunnar called back, just as clear, just as polite, in a way that suggested he'd practiced in the mirror. Water is private here. Show your transit sticker or turn around. Safety hours for swimming start at 10, no boats during swim hours. It's 9:15, Vance said. Does that mean boats are allowed? Gunnar looked at Rita. Rita squinted at her sheet. Not without a sticker, she said. While this legal drama played out in neighborhood theatrical style, a sheriff's patrol boat came around the bend, hull slicing the reflection of clouds into puzzle pieces. You could have mistaken it for a coincidence if the deputy didn't immediately lift 2 fingers as if to say, "Good morning, what nonsense is this?" He idled up next to us and took a long look at the line, then at the signs, then at Gunnar's ratchet. "You can't do that," he said, conversational but firm, like he was telling a nephew the stove was hot. Gunnar said what he had said to me. Well, actually, the deputy's name was stitched on his vest, but I'll keep him nameless. He said, "This is a public navigable waterway. You can't obstruct it with a cable. You can't block passage. Remove it." Rita began to gather words like she was picking berries. "We have liability, people coming from outside, dues, strangers, safety. None of that gives you the authority to fence the river," the deputy said. "Remove it now, or I'll be documenting this as an intentional obstruction, and I'll be calling the appropriate state offices." Gunnar set his jaw like the deputy had asked him to hand over his favorite trophy. He glanced at the neighbors, then back at us. "Fine," he said, meaning not fine at all. He walked to the ratchet, and with a grand show of reluctance, loosened it until the line sagged enough for us to nose over with clearance. The patrol boat slipped through first, then waved us forward. We idled through. I tried to be casual about it, but the truth is, I felt something briny in my chest, and it wasn't just river air. It was the satisfaction of passing a silly border drawn by a group who needed to be told no. As I went by, I said thank you to the deputy and good morning to Gunnar. I also said, loudly enough for the crowd, "I'll be back for a swim at 4:01. The rest of the ride was smooth, almost anticlimactic. We made a lazy loop past the willows, exchanged a hello with a pair of kayakers, and came back with the current. Gunnar had retensioned the cable before we returned, though he left a gap enough for the patrol boat to slip back through too. When I tied up, he shouted from the grass, "You're still being fined." "I'm still not paying," I shouted back. From that morning, the river dispute became the neighborhood sport. If you can imagine a small group of adults turning their lives into a rule book while a larger group tries to quietly enjoy Saturday, you're halfway there. The HOA put out more signs. They revised the water rules twice in a week, each time adding provisions that tried to sound reasonable while missing the point. No music audible from the water, no food near the water, no non-member fishing unless accompanied by a member and wearing a wristband. You could get a wristband by checking in with the board using a scannable code hung from a post like we were running an amusement park. I kept my correspondence polite, documented, and dense with citations. When they sent a new invoice, late fees now added, I sent a letter back referencing state statutes about HOA powers and limits, including a reminder that an association cannot regulate beyond its common area or amend covenants without proper procedure. I included more prints from the federal agency's website about obstructions and the way the public trust doctrine treats water like a civic treasure chest, not a private pool. I copied the email to 2 addresses at the state office so someone would see it even if the board did not. Then something happened that lit the fuse. A family came down the common grassy slope one evening around 5, which was outside designated hours for swimming according to the rule of the week. A little girl in a bright yellow life jacket ran to the edge and asked, "Can we jump, Dad?" Her dad, cautious and clearly the kind who reads warning labels, checked the current and said, "Just the shallows." They waded in. Rita arrived with a clipboard before the dad's ankles were wet. "No swimming after 4, she said. "You're violating rules. We're not on your property," the dad replied, still in that cautious tone of someone trying not to make anything worse. "We're in the river." "Which is private," Rita said, as if she'd been waiting for that moment to announce it in a courtroom. Tilda, who had been watering her tomato jungle, put down the hose and came toward them with the aura of a person who does not need a clipboard to be respected. "The river belongs to everyone," she said. "You can't tell a child she can't kick water at 5 p.m. Rita called for Gunnar. Gunnar arrived with 2 more board members and the same folder he always carried like a shield. An argument blossomed. Phones recorded. Someone threatened to call security again. A fictional character we'd all met in our imaginations. The little girl stood knee-deep, eyes wide, looking from adult to adult the way kids do when they sense that something weird is happening in a place that is supposed to be normal. That night, I wrote and recorded a speech. I am not a soapbox person by nature. I work a job that involves quiet spreadsheets and designs that are more technical than dramatic. But every person has a line where a quiet life gives way to defending it. Mine is apparently a yellow life jacket at 5 p.m. At the board's compliance hearing, I took my turn. They sat at the folding table in the community room like a trio of librarians who had decided shushing wasn't enough, and we needed tickets. Residents filled every chair. Some stood along the back wall. I had a folder too, but mine wasn't a shield. It was a plan. I started with this: you can't own a river. I saw eyebrows go up. I saw Gunnar's jaw move. I kept it steady. I understand wanting to keep people safe. I understand wanting to manage a shared space. But the law is clear. The water itself is not your jurisdiction. The HOA's authority, which is real, stops at the boundaries of the common area and the restrictions that were properly adopted in our covenants. You can't invent new powers and enforce them with fines and cables. It's beyond your scope and it's unlawful. Gunnar interrupted. "We have counsel." "Good," I said. "Our state has an office specifically for associations that exceed their authority. I've submitted complaints there and to the state environmental agency about the cable. The sheriff's office has already told you to remove it. The federal agency responsible for navigable waters has an open file number. The county registrar confirmed our governing documents do not give you the power to manage public water. And while we're here, I'd like to request the financials for the last 2 years. The bylaws guarantee access to them with reasonable notice, and I emailed you that notice last week. Please produce them." A murmur spread like a wave. The financials request wasn't random. I'd noticed something in the last quarterly dues statement. A line item for river security equipment, a suspiciously round number for consulting, and a legal retainer that was double from 6 months prior. When I asked politely what the items included, I was told to submit a formal request, so I did. Then I watched as that request slid into a void. Gunnar shuffled his papers. "This is not the forum." "It is," I said, "because you're trying to levy fines based on rules you made up and to push debt against homes for not complying with those rules. That's a forum issue. And if you're irregular in one place, we have to see if you're irregular in others. Please also include any contracts with vendors, especially the one for the cable installation and any agreement for those orange signs." He drummed his hand on the table. "The board is under no obligation. The bylaws," I said, lifting a printed page, "say you are. Silence is underrated. People think the loudness is where the action is, but it's the quiet that does the work." In the quiet of that room, folks realized they weren't crazy for thinking the cable was crazy. They realized a man with a boat and a folder could ask for paperwork and not be rude. They realized they had power to say, "No, that's not how we do it here." Rita tried to pivot. "We invite you to join the safety committee," she said, a smile like a Velcro patch. "I will," I said, "after the cable is gone." She looked to Gunnar for help. Gunnar looked to the third board member, a quiet man named Deacon, whose entire vibe said, "I did not sign up for this voltage." Deacon avoided both of us and stared at his thumbs. I wrapped my speech carefully. "We all want the same thing, safe, peaceful enjoyment of this place. But if you block a highway, you don't get points for saying it's because kids might run into the road. You fix the fence, not the lane. The river is the lane. You don't get the gate. The board ended the hearing by calling me uncooperative and combative, which is a fun way to describe someone who quotes your own bylaws back at you. They adjourned without giving a single document. On the way out, neighbors clapped my shoulder, pressed notes into my hand, and told me things they'd noticed. Vendors paid in cash. Board meetings moved at the last minute. An email where someone on the board said quiet parts out loud about keeping outsiders from parking near our water. I did not sleep. I'm a restless person when a plan is mid-air. The next morning, I wrote to the federal and state offices again and attached the new details. I printed 10 copies of a Citizen's Guide to Water Rights, hole-punched, and left them in the community room with a label that said, "Please read." I filed a records request with the county for permits related to the bollard on the common area and any previous applications for water control structures. I bought a small, cheap action camera, mounted it on my dock facing the river, and pointed another at my bow lines. I invited Tilda and 2 neighbors I didn't know well to coffee, and together we sketched the bones of something that felt like both defense and celebration: a river parade, a cleanup day, and an information table about the law. If they say it's about safety, we'll prove safety looks like community, Tilda said. The woman is a machine. I also took a quieter step that morning, one that would matter later. I wrote a letter to Gunnar and the board formally requesting a special meeting of the members to recall and replace board directors, as allowed by our bylaws, with signatures of a certain percentage of owners. I had already collected that number and then some in the 18 hours after the hearing, because apparently once people have a folder thrust at them with highlights and a calm voice, they will sign almost anything that promises to end the nonsense. I delivered the letter by hand and certified mail. I took a picture of the envelope in Gunnar's mailbox because I am not new to people saying, "We never received that." By lunch, an email went out from the board accusing certain residents of spreading misinformation and of attracting unwanted attention from outside agencies. It warned that fines would double for interfering with board operations. It also announced a new rule: all boats must display a board-issued number visible from shore. I replied to the list with one sentence: "Please stop writing rules for water you don't own." A response came 5 minutes later: "Cease and desist your threatening communications." I added another page to the folder, a printed copy of that email with a sticky note that said, "They think disagreeing is a threat now." That evening, 2 teens slid a canoe into the river and paddled lazily against the current until they hovered over the cable. They looked at it for a long time, talked softly, then turned around and headed back. Fear was doing part of the board's job for them. After dinner, I walked my dock and watched the dusk slide the world toward blue. A heron performed a jog that only herons can look good doing. I breathed through my nose until my brain slowed down. When I came back from that little meditation, harbor at my heel, I noticed my bowline was different. The knot I tied that morning, always the same knot because I'm a creature of habit, looked like someone else's handwriting on a postcard you'd sent to yourself. It wasn't wrong exactly, but it wasn't mine. I knelt and traced the tail. It had been untied and retied. The camera I had mounted earlier that day blinked its little red eye at me. I went inside, pulled the SD card, and watched. What I saw would have made a less patient person do something they'd regret. It was Gunnar, glancing around, stepping onto my dock, untying the bowline, tugging like he wanted to see if he could set the boat loose. He retied it after a few seconds when Harbor barked from inside. He looked right at the camera and smirked. Then he walked away with the same leisurely stride he used when delivering fines. I saved the video to 3 places. I emailed a copy to myself and to a folder titled, "When This Needs to Be a Thing." I printed a still of Gunnar's face looking right at the lens and pinned it to my vision board of lawful stubbornness. The next morning, I took a thumb drive to the sheriff's office and filed a report for tampering. The deputy who had been on the boat recognized Gunnar and wrote down the time. He asked if I wanted to seek a protective order. I said not yet, but I would be serving him with a cease and desist of my own. This one drafted with an attorney's help, because at some point you stop being polite and you start building a record. By afternoon, the board had deployed a new tactic: orange-vested river ambassadors who hovered near the water like lifeguards in cargo shorts. They were volunteers, neighbors who had been convinced that outsiders were spoiling something precious and that the only way to protect it was to deputize themselves. They weren't bad people. They were just being used. One of them was a young dad named Trevor, who sheepishly asked my visiting niece and me if we'd please wear wristbands. I looked at his toddler sitting in the grass, playing with a pine cone like it was a spaceship, and I said, "Hey, I get that you want everyone safe, but the river, it's for everybody. We don't need wristbands to splash." Trevor nodded slowly, and I watched a little piece of goodwill sit down between us. That night, I reviewed my plan again. It had 4 parts: get the cable removed by force of law, expose the board's overreach and hold them to their own rules, protect my property and the neighbors who just wanted to fish and float, and, this was my favorite part, replace the power with something better so the problem wouldn't grow back like kudzu. I was about to close my laptop when an email popped up from a state environmental compliance officer, whose name I'll keep private. It said, in that pleasant bureaucratic tone I've grown to respect, "We have received your complaint regarding the obstruction across the river. We will be coordinating with neighboring agencies as the obstruction appears to impede navigation within a public waterway. Please reply with any additional photos or videos." I replied with an entire album. 2 days later, a new letter arrived from the board. The subject line might as well have been, "We're doubling down," because it was a notice of lien intent. They claimed I owed hundreds in fines, plus assessments related to river equipment, and that if I didn't pay, they'd pursue a lien against my home. It was signed electronically by Gunnar. The letter made the mistake of citing a section of the bylaws that, when I turned to it, said nothing about liens for fines of this kind. It dealt with maintenance assessments for common elements. It was like they'd played cut and paste with legal authority. I called an attorney who has a reputation for dealing with associations that mistake the authority to maintain a fence for the power to run a kingdom. He reviewed the documents and said, "They're exceeding their scope. Send me the financials when you get them. If they try to record a lien based on fines for rules beyond their jurisdiction, we'll move for a swift release and damages." "Should we wait for the special meeting?" I asked. "Run both tracks," he said. "Administrative reform and legal pressure. Don't bluff. Follow through." By now you might be thinking this sounds like a lot of work to go for a swim or take a boat ride. It is, but the thing about living in a place you care about is that it's worth doing work to keep it kind. The board's power play wasn't just about water. It was about whether neighbors are subjects or citizens. It was about whether someone can wave a folder and call it authority. It was, in the most old-fashioned American way, about who gets to throw open the screen door and walk to the river without asking for permission they don't need. The morning of our river parade, the sky cooperated. Sunny, not punishing, a breeze like cut grass. We didn't call it a protest. It was a cleanup and safety day with a boat and float. Tilda baked trout-shaped cookies, Vance laminated cards on river rights, and Orla set a table with whistles and noodles. Neighbors came, plus folks from up and down river. A pastor brought a canoe. An older couple offered ferry rides so newcomers could see the banks from the waterline. Gunnar showed in a polo with the association logo, flanked by 3 river ambassadors. He unfolded a chair beside the ratchet tensioner, cooler and clipboard ready, as if he planned to sit all day watching for infractions. We picked up trash, foam from buoys, a few picnic plastics, and bagged it. We set up the safety table and wore life jackets even knee-deep. We offered cookies to the ambassadors. 2 accepted. One said, "We're not allowed to accept things." At noon, a state environmental officer arrived with a county code officer. They studied the cable, measured, photographed, and conferred. The khaki officer asked who spoke for the HOA. Gunnar raised his hand. The officer said what I'd been saying. "This cable has to come down. It's an unlawful obstruction of a public waterway. Remove it today, or we will. Penalties may apply." Gunnar tried the greatest hits: liability, safety, members only. The officers nodded and repeated, "You can adopt reasonable rules for property you own." They pointed to the grass. "But you cannot regulate the river or restrict access, and you cannot string a cable across it. Remove it." The ambassadors looked at each other. Trevor, one of them, stepped toward the tensioner. "Let's just take it down," he said. Gunnar loosened the ratchet. The cable slithered into the river. The officers pulled it ashore and cut it into sections. It should have ended there. By late afternoon, the state office emailed a written warning, the board's response, an emergency rulemaking meeting, and a threat to tow non-compliant vessels from private docks, naming mine. I called my attorney. "Prepare for the special meeting," he said. The room filled early. Before the gavel, the county officer walked in, followed by the state officer. The county officer handed Gunnar a sealed envelope. "Read this into your minutes," he said. Gunner tried to skip it and rushed into emergency measures, boat numbers, wristbands even in the water, and a ban on resident events that attract outsiders, all temporary. I raised a point of order. 48 hours notice is required unless there's a documented hazard. What hazard is documented in writing? The only hazard we documented, the county officer said, was your cable. The state officer read the notice. Unauthorized obstruction, public trust doctrine, federal navigational servitude, warning issued, fines for recurrence, referral for overreach. Residents' riparian access shall not be impeded by private rule. They adjourned with nothing passed. Outside, a tow truck idled by the ramp with a photocopied order to tag and tow a white trawler, dock behind 18. I called the deputy. He arrived, told the driver the HOA had zero authority to tow a private vessel from a private dock, and sent him away, with a cancellation fee billed to the HOA. The HOA's final demand landed the next morning, followed by my attorney's cease and desist. Ignored. So we filed for a declaratory judgment, an injunction, and relief for the attempted lien and dock tampering. Meanwhile, I pushed the special meeting. They tried to derail it by locking the room with a sign, postponed due to safety concerns. Our bylaws let us reconvene at the nearest public hall, so we marched to the church. Statements, then ballots. The result wasn't close, the board recalled. A new slate elected. We rescinded all water rules, told council to stipulate to an injunction, and opened the books. The audit found self-dealing. Consulting to a P.O. box tied to Gunner, overpriced buoys, triple-billed wristbands, and attorney consults no firm could confirm. We demanded repayment, notified the state, and looped in the insurer. A judge granted our injunction. The association shall not erect, authorize, or maintain any barrier, sign, policy, or enforcement mechanism purporting to control the public waterway. We installed life rings, throw ropes, and a county safety sign. The ambassadors became river buddies. In mediation, Gunner agreed to resign, repay identified sums, accept a 5-year ban from office, and join a public apology. We saved a piece of the illegal cable bolted to a plaque. We amended the bylaws. No governing beyond the property line. No emergency rules without real emergencies. A month later, we held a 401 swim. Laughter, my niece shouting "See you HOA" as she splashed. That's the story. A cable, a crowd, a reset, rights held, safety improved, neighbors acting like neighbors. The river moves. We learn to move with it. Friends, thank you. See you soon.